Some people will say they just don't care, while others will turn a blind eye. But as for me, looking back through the years to see the different and the disparity between the different ethnicity in the United States, let me realize that there is a favoritism, a racially drawn line, an invisible scene that sometimes racially you cannot even tell that it is there. It is subtle. And in other cases, it is blatantly outrageous. Let me to draw this conclusion. After seeing many things, going back to my time spent in Jamaica, traveling other parts of the world, and see how certain countries operate, let me come to this conclusion, and this is my opinion, that the United States government or structural system that's set up is not favorable to people of African descent. Some would call themselves African Americans. Some would say I'm just a plain American. Others that came here and became citizens and live, yes, we do enjoy somewhat a normal life outside of the country that we were born. And it is by design. The more I get to understand and the more I look into the things that take place in the world, I realize that things like these is more of a design. I remember back in Jamaica when the violence started, and also remember how Jamaica was treated by the United States. I remember at a particular time when the Cubans was there. The Cubans was there in Jamaica, and to my knowledge and the things that I see visible, when you go to the doctor or when you go to the hospital, there was enough doctors at the hospital. The Cubans, they send the doctors and people to help out in Jamaica. They build schools that benefited Jamaica. And I remember that the United States was very upset with that, and they asked that the Cubans should leave. And that was one thing that I could not understand, how people that come to your country to help and to make things better for you, people wouldn't want them to stay. But fast forward, I remember also how they treat the marijuana system in Jamaica, how both the American and the Jamaican, they would come together to destroy the marijuana crop. When Peter Touch and other Jamaicans were saying it is time to legalize it, they said, no, we cannot legalize weed in Jamaica or ganja or whatever you want to call it in Jamaica because it is not good for Jamaica. Fast forward 40 years later, the United States decided that they're the one that should profit from weed and they legalize it. These are things that I cannot understand. They bring the crack into the country, use the Caribbean to bring the crack into the country, destroy the Caribbean, bring it into the black communities in America. But the thing is, they never realized that once you do these things, the white people and other people is going to turn to it. And the thing is, they put all the black people in prison for doing crack and selling crack. Now, when the white people are doing it, they say that it is a medical crisis. When you look at all these hypocrisies, many people love to turn a blind eye. They don't want to know, they don't want to see. And when they see it, they act as it is not there. And digging up and going back to the crack era and to see the role that the United States play in this crack development to destroy many black lives intentionally. Many people don't want to believe it. They act as if it's not real, and they act as if, all is well, but it is not.
One, that you are dealing with people who are ruthless, they're well-financed, they're very skillful, they're very experienced, and they are international, which means they literally can pick and choose their means, their methods, the routes that they use, and so on and so forth. Now, over against that is a relatively inexperienced intelligence capability, interdiction capability, that is now trying to deal with a very sophisticated operation. And so that in controlling the flow, there is the huge technical problem that results from that. So this thing is organized globally, directed globally, and managed globally. They're so skillful that if I, for instance, begin to block my airports, which I'm trying to do, as a way station to the United States market, there are 6 others they can choose.
How are you blocking your airports?
Well, we've done 2 things. We had to move our army in temporarily because we discovered that our airports had become like a sieve. The whole thing had been, I think, completely corrupted. And huge amounts were going through our things, landing in Miami, places like that, threatening our own economy with consequences and being all that danger and damage to you. So what I did was to move out all the people there who were responsible, putting the army on a temporary basis, unarmed, but just to have a force that was disciplined and could hopefully manage the situation while we train a new type of force.
Was that effective?
It's not been 100%, but it's been a vast improvement. And there's the other aspect in that where there are different levels of capability, skill at detection, interdiction, intelligence, and so on and so forth, you get soft points in any kind of international defense system against drugs. That is what has led me, for instance, to be exploring the idea of some kind of international force that would deal with interdiction, have narcotics agents, intelligence services, training, that sort of thing, which was organized internationally and could be on call to countries who suddenly find themselves in the middle of this crisis.
Like an Interpol?
Right, like an Interpol 4, specific for this kind of thing. But particularly because if I suddenly find myself in the middle of it and I'm out of my depth, I don't even know who's doing it, my intelligence services are not good enough to even pinpoint who the Mr. Bigs are. To be able to bring in a force that could help me while I try to train my people to a higher level of skill is valuable for me and very valuable for the international effort. So that's a thing that we have floated and we're beginning to explore it. We've thought possibly of trying to get a UN convention about drug trafficking in which countries pledge mutual support to each other and under whose aegis you could begin to develop a trained international force of that sort.
But I remember a time in Jamaica where your government got really tough because of violence associated with drugs. Back in the early 70s, you had a gun court and very stiff sentences for people caught with even gun paraphernalia, indeterminate sentences, all kinds of things that some civil libertarians quarreled with, but it seemed to be effective in the context. What happened?
What happened to Jamaica is that Jamaica became preoccupied with other problems. Jamaica developed all sorts of internal tensions, which I think distracted everybody's attention, diverted everybody's attention from that problem. But in fact, you know, we were the first country in that part of the world to work with the Drug Enforcement Agency on a program of eradication, of interdiction, and of crop substitution, where we began to try to train our farmers who would grow marijuana to get into other crops so they could have an alternative livelihood.
There's been the suggestion in recent months that the U.S. begin to do something like that once again with the coca crops in countries where they grow, Colombia to name one. How do you feel about that? I mean, can the United States just do that?
That's one of the things that we feel you could get around if you had an international force. Because the force that would come in to help you with eradication wouldn't be identified with a superpower and questions of sovereignty, but would be an international force whose very personnel might be the same, but whose sponsorship would seem to be different, and certainly would help with that problem. Over crop substitution, I know this is controversial. Some people have said that that is rewarding people who have been in criminal activity. I frankly think that's a totally naive and almost childish point of view, if you don't mind my saying so. Because the truth is that mostly the people that grow these things are traditional, they are generally peasant farmers who have grown up with this as a way to survive and live. The criminals are the pushers and the transshippers, the people who gun people down so as to get it where they want, and so on and so forth. And generally the grower is the simplest of peasant farmer. Our feeling is that if he is going to be asked, as you must, to give up what he knows is a little support for his children and family, then you owe it to him in common humanity to go straight another way that is legal and acceptable. And your common sense tells you that if you want to unite the community around that person, show the human concern and interest. Because if you don't, you may appear, though you are doing what you have to do, you may appear like a tyrant, just blotting out this little guy's chance to live. Whereas if you help him, everybody will unite around the fact that you're doing something positive.
If you were advising our drug control director, William Bennett, on what you think he should do, from where you sit, and from the needs that you and the countries in the Caribbean have, what would you say?
I would say, number one, to continue to give us the bilateral support that they are giving now.
That's between the U.S. and Jamaica.
Which is very helpful. So continue that if possible. Beef it up a little. Number two, examine with us the whole question of a multilateral force, some kind of either regional or completely international force that could be built up under some kind of agreed sponsorship and international or regional authority. But thirdly, I think that the critical thing for all of us in the end is whether we can all, large or small, get the kind of public education, child education, and consciousness-raising programs going that eventually begin to kill the demand side.
And you can go up against the cartels, millions and billions and everything they have with that approach, you think?
No, you have to fight the cartel in the short run. You have no choice. You have to fight them. All I'm saying is that you're going to be fighting a very, very long war if what the cartel is doing is supplying a $500 billion market. Until you can find a way to reduce that market because people don't want it anymore. And that is to do with education. It is to do with poverty, with ghetto hopelessness, with maybe kids who are coming out of broken homes and are trying to patch up their own shattered lives. You know, I don't pretend it's simple. But, you know, I think we have to begin to understand that in the end, the root of the problem lies in the question, why is there this terrible, voracious market?
Well, Prime Minister Manley, thank you very much.
Thank you.
But in 1982, Democrats in Congress passed laws to cut off support for the Nicaraguan rebels. So the Contras and their CIA backers had to find new ways of funding their struggle. What they found was cocaine. By the late 1970s, more people in the US were snorting coke than ever before. Most of it imported from Colombia. In the early 80s, smokable cocaine, or crack, exploded across American cities. This proved to be a gold mine for countless organized crime groups, even those backed by the CIA.
And today, cocaine and marijuana are found throughout our society from top to bottom. And that means corruption, top to bottom, and gang war violence.
The Contras were soon linked with Colombian cartels, and in 1985, reporters Robert Parry and Brian Barger broke an almost unbelievable story. They claimed Nicaraguan rebels were involved in cocaine trafficking, and that not only did the CIA know about these activities, they allowed them to continue in order to help fund the Contras' war effort.
When Bob Perry and Brian Barger got a hold of a CIA report revealing that they were working in the mid-1980s with Contras fighting the Sandinista government, they were warned by their editors that this was not something that was going to make the people that own their newspapers very happy, and most of them ended up losing their jobs.
At this point, the CIA strongly denied that they were involved in the drug trade. But on the streets, the rumors began to spread that the government was either actively or passively allowing crack to be sold. These remained just rumors until 1996, when a reporter with the San Jose Mercury News named Gary Webb picked up the story from a new angle. Webb investigated the case of Freeway Rick Ross, who in the early 1980s was the most important kingpin in LA's crack scene. and probably America's first ever crack millionaire.
What's the most money you ever made in a day?
$3 million.
What Webb uncovered was that Ross's main cocaine supplier was a guy named Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan exile who funneled tens of thousands of dollars in cocaine profits back to the Contras through banks in Miami. Blandon, in turn, worked for Norwin Menezes, perhaps the biggest drug trafficker in Nicaragua, who had deep ties to the Contra leadership and was widely thought to benefit from CIA protection.
The DEA had always tried to arrest Nora Menezes, who was living openly and raising money for the Contras, but had never been able to build a case against him, and felt like there was something about this guy that must explain why they couldn't do that he was protected, in other words. And when Gary Webb's story came along, he not only showed where the connection was between Menezes and Blandon and Freeway Ricky Ross, but he also went into all this history and unveiled how there was a very large, well-documented crack distribution ring that had operated for years, with the CIA turning a blind eye.
What's the process you go through? Okay, you're the guy on top, and where do you get your coke from?
I was getting my coke from a guy by the name of Oscar Danilo Blandon, who also was my informant. He's the guy that set me up with the police. When I went to trial, we found out that he was what they call a Contra. The Contras was backed by the CIA, and it sparked this big investigation by this reporter called Gary Webb.
In August of 1996, the Mercury News published Webb's reports in a 3-part series titled Dark Alliance. The story grabbed attention across the US, particularly amongst the African American community, which had been targeted by law enforcement following the rise of crack.
Tell America what the story is about. It was about a cocaine ring that operated along the west coast of the United States throughout most of the 80s. And some of the money they were making was going to support an army that the men who ran the cocaine ring worked for, called the FDN. This was an army that the CIA started in 1981 and supported.
Better known to us, most of us who remember news, the Contras.
Nowhere in Dark Alliance did Webb explicitly assert that the CIA was responsible for the crack epidemic, let alone that they intentionally sold the drug. But that was the narrative that got picked up in the popular imagination, probably not helped by the Mercury News illustrating the feature with an image of a guy smoking a crack pipe superimposed on the CIA logo. But the story took off not just due to his explosive claims, but also because of another new and highly addictive force that had begun to reshape American society: the internet. Dark Alliance was the first major piece of investigative journalism to be published simultaneously in print and online. The story went viral, getting picked up by everyone from street protesters to talk radio hosts and eventually politicians looking to attack the Reagan and Bush administrations. California Congresswoman Maxine Waters became a particular champion of the piece.
As a public elected officials, all of us must be concerned that our government could have anyway been involved in drug trafficking.
The reaction to the story was so intense that the CIA director took the unprecedented step of defending the agency at a heated LA community meeting.
It is an appalling charge that goes to the heart of this country. I will get to the bottom of it, and I will let you know the results of what I found.
How are we supposed to trust the CIA official to investigate themselves?
What was equally shocking, though, was the reaction of America's mainstream media. Webb and the San Jose Mercury News often maintained that Dark Alliance was intended as the beginning of an investigation that larger newspapers with more resources could then continue. But what actually happened was that instead of investigating the CIA, major papers like the LA Times, Washington Post, and New York Times all attacked Webb himself. Webb was eventually hounded from his job and found himself unable to work as a journalist. He died by suicide in 2004.
All 3 major newspapers felt completely caught off guard by this story, so they fully attacked Gary Webb with a vengeance, unlike anything that had ever been seen before, and completely attempted to not only discredit his story and frame it as a conspiracy theory, but pretty much ruin his entire reputation.
We saw a complete failure, perhaps one of the most shameful examples of how the mainstream press can operate in destroying a fellow journalist for getting at an important story. And Webb suffered mightily for this.
But as people got more and more lost in the minutiae of attacking or defending Webb's journalism, the focus on the CIA's involvement in the drug trade began to get lost. A fact that internal CIA documents held up as a good example of managing a public relations nightmare. But in 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report essentially admitting that many elements of the Dark Alliance story were true, that the agency had known that people linked with the Contras were importing cocaine, had done nothing to stop them, and had even protected them from investigation.
So you had the CIA finally coming to the table and admitting that what we reported in the 80s and what Webb reported in the 90s was in fact true.
Mr. Meneses was actually indicted in 1984. He was known within, my own sources in DEA told me he was known as El Rey de la Droga, the king of drugs. He was in more than 40 files and indicted mysteriously, and people within DEA say that it was CIA intervention that kept this sealed indictment from ever being opened.
In one case detailed in the report, when traffickers linked to the Nicaraguan king of drugs, Norwin Meneses, were busted in San Francisco in 1983, the CIA even requested that tens of thousands of dollars, which had been seized, be returned to the drug traffickers.
The CIA admitted that they knew that these guys were selling drugs and had went to the Attorney General and asked the Attorney General could they not report it because the mission that they were trying to accomplish was so big. It was a matter of U.S., what do they call it?
National security?
National security.
So wait, the CIA was allowing this just kind of to happen, the drugs to go in, and they weren't putting it there, but they were allowing it to happen and funneling the money.
That's what we believe.
This is a complex story, but let's try to answer the big questions. Did the CIA actually sell crack? On the evidence we've got, no. There were no agents with sunglasses and earpieces slinging rocks on the streets of Compton. Did the CIA work with and protect major drug traffickers? Yes, absolutely. They've been forced to admit that publicly. The real tragedy here is that as far as we know, no one from the CIA or the mainstream media even lost their jobs over this. The only people who suffered for it were the journalists who exposed the story and the millions of people targeted by the unjust and racist laws that were passed in response to the 1980s crack crisis.
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.